Well, with me in the studio are Councillor Jeremy Birch. Jeremy is the leader of Hastings Borough Council. Lucy Parsons of the independent think tank Reform, which has just published its own budget. And the Minister for Decentralisation and the MP for Tunbridge Wells, Greg Clark. Good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Jeremy, let's start with you. 2% cut. That's going to be one of the highest cuts in the country. What are you going to do? What will be the impact?
It is the highest cut in the country. There's 10 councils who've had a 2% cut. Hastings is one of them. It's the largest cut in the southeast, and it will be very difficult. We're having a meeting on Friday with the community organisations, different representatives, to see what is it out of the additional money, because it's not the core grant that every council gets to run its business. It's the additional money, deprivation-based money. And will we have to cut our street wardens? Will we have to cut the money we spend on young people, on employability skills, social skills? Will we have to cut some of the things we spend on community safety to make the town safer? And they are hard decisions we've got to take, and I think very unfair that a town like Hastings gets a cut when Tunbridge Wells doesn't. OK,
well, let's just take a look at something that's already impacted on you, the Future Jobs Scheme. I mean, this was something that gave 6 months' employment to young people who couldn't find themselves a job otherwise. Sure. That's going. What's the impact of that? Well,
Hastings Borough Council manages the Future Jobs Fund for the whole of East Sussex. So we're talking about 170 young people who will have gone through the scheme. March of next year, it ends. That's it. It finishes. And if you talk to the young people who've been on this scheme, they get a CV, they've got experience, they haven't spent 6 months doing nothing. They've spent 6 months with an employer who will validate what they've done and put them in a much better position to get full-time employment.
OK, well, let's put your concerns to Greg Clark. Greg, there is a concern here that an area like Hastings, where there is significant deprivation, and you might well be talking about Thanet as well here in Kent, that those places are going to be hit the hardest. It doesn't seem fair, and your government's always talking about being fair in terms of the cuts that are coming.
Well, I think the context is obviously the whole country is facing big cuts, and we've got to get the economy back on track. We've been very careful to make sure that the impact has been reduced. I mean, the original proposals that would come out of the formula for Hastings were very much more severe than was the case, and ministers intervened to make sure that no council across the country would have more than a 2% impact. And it is, as Jeremy says, it's just on these additional programmes. We've also protected the core funds going to local government, which was quite an achievement. I can tell you can imagine with the cuts across the country, to protect the core grant for local government was something that we fought hard for. And it contrasts with the 10% cuts, for example, that we're imposing on central government in this area. So I'm not saying that it's not going to be difficult, but we've done what we can to protect areas. And we've also done something else, which is to take away the ring fencing, so that Jeremy and his colleagues can use funds that they may not have wanted to spend on certain things that they were obliged to direct them to where they want to, and taking some of the bureaucracy away as well, so they could save some money on that.
Right, well, we haven't even got into the nitty-gritty yet, so let's try and do that, about how people will be affected. And let's bring Lucy Parsons from Reform in on that one. According to your budget, just give us a few examples of things that you think should be cut, that will be things that people will know, what it means to them as individuals.
Really, what we say in our budget is that it's the big spending areas that we've got to look at first. That is things like health, education, welfare. So it will mean, for example, the 30 billion or so that go to middle classes in terms of benefits, things like child benefit, child trust fund, those will have to be cut first. It will mean in healthcare, for example, people having greater supplementary insurance. It will mean
paying to see your GP?
Exactly, that's quite common actually in a lot of other countries like New Zealand, Hong Kong. People do pay to see their GP, so we'll probably have to bring in that kind of thing. In higher education, people will have to see it not as a right to go to university, but as a privilege and something that people will have to pay towards.
Well, let's talk specifically about the South East. I mean, you talked about healthcare there, and some people think it's sacred and you should never touch the NHS budgets. You, for instance, think the maternity ward at Maidstone Hospital should go. On what grounds?
Well, it's been running at about 52% occupancy. It was shut, I think, 97 times in 2008. And under the previous government, there was a plan to try to downgrade the maternity ward and to centralise maternity services over in Pembury. And it's that kind of thing. I think we can't expect that these very big, very expensive hospitals that provide all kinds of services that you might want to keep going. We are going to have to move things so that certain places provide certain services, there are smaller units, and that care really moves out of these big hospitals and into primary care, so the GP surgery is providing more services.
Is there anything there, Jeremy, that you think's acceptable? I mean, overall, everyone's saying at the moment we've got to have these cuts. The country cannot continue spending as it has been. And I know it's difficult to hear when you've got people who live in real deprivation where you work, but the cuts have got to fall somewhere, haven't they?
We all recognise public spending is going to be a problem and a challenge and has to be dealt with. One of the problems at the moment is we're dealing with in-year cuts, and that is cuts to budgets you've already set. You have to find £300,000, £400,000 worth of cuts in the middle of the year. Then that's a lot more difficult.
You must have some ideas what sorts of things you're going to have to cut. I mean, we're just trying to get an idea for people sitting at home, perhaps people who live in Hastings.
Well, for the in-year cuts, we have to look at the areas I was referring to. For the longer-term cuts, I think we need a big debate. I think you actually need to go to the public and say, what would your spending priorities be? Not what you want cut. What would your spending priorities be? And people will tell you, well, when it comes to it, I mean, I think people are more intelligent than we sometimes give them credit for. People will tell you that area of recycling, for example, is absolutely vital. We can't reduce that. That's one of my spending priorities. Or cleanliness on the streets, or crime and safety. And then you have to look at the issues they put much, much lower down on their spending priorities. And unfortunately, then you have to say, we may have to take money from those areas first.
Well, you've got to hope that everyone agrees.
I think that's exactly the right approach, and it's what we're going to be talking about decentralisation. These are going to be difficult, but I think it's really important that you have local people making those choices and making those priorities rather than having this imposed from afar.